It is my honor to welcome you all here this afternoon. And yes, we have a very robust discussion topic. So I'm going to go ahead and jump right in as people continue to join our Zoom today. Hello, my name is Elizabeth Halajian. I am a proud AFP Chicago board member and the chair of the AFP Chicago Philanthropy Committee, which helps to secure partnerships and support of our chapter to make incredible programs like this afternoon's possible. It is great to see such engagement and registration from our members for today's discussion. And as we jump in, I want to just give our deep gratitude and thanks to CCS, not only for guiding us through today's conversation, but for their support as well, for their support of AFP Chicago. Thank you, CCS presenters, and also your colleagues that are on the call today. We really couldn't execute our mission without you. I also would like to engage with all of you and share the AFP Chicago Land Acknowledgement and Brave and Safe Space Agreement. So AFP Chicago recognizes that the land on which we live and work includes the traditional homelands of the Miami, Sook, and Ho-Chunk and Menominee, and the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and Potawatomi nations. Our city is still home to more than 40,000 Native Americans. By acknowledging the land, we recognize that it holds significance for its original stewards, the Native nations, and the peoples of the region. And AFP's Brave and Safe Space Agreement is in order for us to communicate openly and honestly. AFP Chicago proposes a Brave and Safe Space Agreement. The agreement is that all participants will help to create our space while bearing these principles in mind. Keep focused, notice power dynamics in the room, create spaces for multiple truths and norms, be kind and brave, be mindful of the space you take up, examine bias systems and processes, and look for learning. And by entering an AFP Chicago space, we ask for your commitment in embracing this agreement together. So with that, you will notice that this is a meeting format and not a webinar format. So to that point, please stay muted when you are not speaking. If you have a question for our presenters today, we encourage you to use the chat feature at the bottom of your screen. There will be time for Q&A, and we'll get to as many questions as possible. And I also encourage you, we will have an evaluation on a QR code at our final slide and sent following today's presentation. That QR code will include a recording, but it also includes an evaluation, and we ask you to please complete that so that we can share feedback with our presenters, with our partners, and make our programming even better. So with all of that covered, it is my true honor to introduce our speakers for today's session. Joining us from CCS, we have Becky Kiely, who is Assistant Vice President, Phillippa Paisley, Director, and Doug London, Executive Vice President, who will be facilitating today's program. We are very grateful to all three of you for being with us and lending your expertise on this meaningful topic. So without further ado, I will pass things off to Doug to get us started. Doug?
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, and to everyone at AFP. We're very excited to be with you today. It's excited to see so many familiar faces and names on the screen that we've had the privilege of working with and getting to know over the past number of years, as well as some other CCS colleagues. So welcome to everyone. I would like to start by asking Becky and Phillippa to introduce themselves, and then we'll go through a bit of an agenda of our day today and talk a little bit about CCS, and then we'll jump into the 2021 giving trend. So Becky, I'll turn it to you.
Great, thanks, Doug. Hi, everyone. To echo Doug's thanks, we are so excited to be here with all of you today. Thank you for welcoming each of us on CCS to speak with you about this data that affects all of our work. I am in my 5th year with CCS and have worked with some of you on the call at some other Chicago institutions before coming to the firm with my friends at Cristo Rey Jesuit High School in Pilsen and Loyola University Chicago, and I'm a proud Chicagoan myself, at least for the last 10 years, and glad to be here today with all of you.
Hi, everyone. Hi, my name is Phillippa Paisley, and I'm a director here at CCS. Really happy to be here in the space with you all to be talking about the different trends in the philanthropic landscape. I've been a director here at CCS a little bit under a year, and I've been in Chicago a little bit under 4 years. So pretty familiar. And prior to being here at CCS, I was doing a very rigorously quantitative degree at the University of Chicago, doing a master's in public policy. And I'm very rooted in social policy and philanthropic impact, which we try to definitely empower our clients here at CCS. And we're so happy to present to you today these trends, which will definitely help in the philanthropic strategy. So we hope that this conversation will be helpful for all, and we look forward to a lively and informative discussion.
Thanks, Becky. Thanks, Phillippa. My name is Doug London. I'm an executive vice president at CCS. I have the privilege to serve as one of the leaders of our Central United States team, which is based out of Chicago. I have spent my career in philanthropy, first at the American Cancer Society and then at the Alzheimer's Association prior to coming to CCS about 9 years ago. And outside of my client-facing work, I have the opportunity and privilege to lead much of our diversity, equity, and inclusion work at the firm, serving as the executive sponsor of our GLBTQ employee resource group, as well as our working parents community. A little bit about what we're going to talk about today, a brief about CCS. We don't want this to be a lot about us, but would like to tell you a little about who we are. And then we'll dig into looking, very macro at the 2021 US giving trends, information that comes from the from the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy at Indiana University came out last month. Excited to dig into that with you. And then we'll talk about how that applies to each of our work here in Chicago. Throughout our conversation, you've heard Elizabeth and Becky and Phillippa note discussion, not presentation. So we really do ask everyone to utilize the chat feature, raise your hand. We'd love to hear from you, and we will have some opportunities for conversation throughout, but please don't hesitate in the interim. CCS is a 75-year-old philanthropic services firm. We as an organization have the great opportunity to partner with nonprofit organizations, large and small, across the country and the globe at every stage of their philanthropic journey. So from creating cases for support, training and coaching leadership, to creating and implementing and executing extraordinary fundraising campaigns. We have the privilege of partnering shoulder to shoulder with our client partners at every stage. You've heard Phillippa talk about this. We are a data-driven firm, and so we are really always excited. And I myself am a self-described data nerd, so excited to dig into this data with you today. But really, data is a foundation of all of our work, and so we look forward to digging into that with you today. With that, I will turn it to Phillippa, who will talk about the 2021 US giving trends. Again, as a reminder, this data all comes from Giving USA, which is comes out annually in conjunction with the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy at Indiana University. And with that, I will turn it to Phillippa to share some really exciting news from this report.
Thank you so much, Doug. And we'll start by looking at the overall philanthropic landscape. Giving USA has reported that charitable giving in the United States reached $484.85 billion in 2021. And on average, we see that US individuals, corporations, and foundations donated about 1.33 billion per day. And while this number seems to be a record high, it is not a huge increase from 2020 charitable giving, which came in at about $471 billion. We look at the trajectory period from 1981 to 2021. We see that there are some economic, social, and political events that have happened. And specifically in 2020, there was an impact, of course, COVID-19 and other challenges that continued as a factor. Some of these other challenges were racial justice and social justice movements. And currently, we're experiencing one of the highest inflation rates in 40 years. So despite these challenges, in 2021, there was growth in the S&P 500, as well as the GDP, and moderate growth for personal disposable income, which would attribute for the giving increasing in 2021. Next slide. And then we see that giving grew in 6 out of 10 sectors in 2021. Overall, donors resumed their giving to their pre-pandemic priorities. So that includes public society benefit, arts and culture, and the humanities organizations that have experienced considerable growth in 2021. But in 2020, we see a flip there where we see a lot of, we see a growth in racial justice and educational giving. But giving to religion resumed a moderate growth after a slight decline in 2020. And then after reaching a record giving in 2020, international affairs, human services, and education experienced low growth or decline in 2021. And then just the giving environment, giving to the environment and animals, as well as public society benefit organizations and foundations have seen growth for 2 consecutive years. And while environment is the smallest category, we have seen impressive growth over time. As we look at the year-over-year changes, we see that there's a mixed result. Corporations show a strong growth. Bequests, and that's giving as it pertains to giving through a legacy or a will, have declined, and individuals and foundation giving fell in between. So when we look at inflation being higher in the recent years, if we adjust some of these numbers, this may paint a different picture of the breakdown in giving. And as I mentioned bequest before, it's important to think about bequests as it pertains to your strategy for individual giving. There's a phenomena happening in recent times called the Great Wealth Transfer, where we see wealth being transferred from the baby boomers over to the Gen X's and the millennials. And it is an important point to think about when it comes to making strategy for engaging with individual giving. So it is important as philanthropic organizations to ensure that you have a capacity to accept bequests. And this will inform an important and inclusive way of engaging donors. As we move to the next slide, even though bequest giving have declined, we have seen an increase in grants and giving from donor advised funds. The number of individual donor advised funds in the US have surged to over 1 million, and grants from donor advised funds to charitable organizations have increased by 27% between the year 2019 and 2021, reaching a record high of $34 billion. And donor advised fund payout rate was its highest as it has been since 2011, and that is at 23.8%. And then looking at giving for equity, we see that this continued to soar from 2020 up until 2021. And the amount of publicly announced donations in support for racial justice efforts in 2020 and 2021 alone amounted to $15 billion, which is 4.1 times more than the previous 9 years combined. So it is important to take this into consideration when we look at the overall trend of giving and see that this year's number is really it balancing out to the natural trajectory of giving trending upwards. And I'll I'll pass it on to my colleague Becky to give you more insights on the US philanthropic trends.
Thanks so much, Phillippa. I'm going to walk us through now how this record year of giving breaks down across our primary giving sources, with a zoom into individuals, foundations, and corporate giving. As you can see, the headline here is that individuals continue to drive charitable giving, contributing over 67%, or about $326 billion in 2021. When we think about family foundations and bequests, those are not counted in that big blue ring here. Those would be spread across the gray and the yellow sections. If we add in individual giving from those sections, total giving from individuals in the US makes up close to 85% of charitable giving. So this is, the same as we've seen in the past. Individual donors continue to drive philanthropy and should be such an important part of all of our fundraising efforts. And looking at the next slide, we can dive in a little bit more about individual giving. That total means that 7 of every $10 donated to charity was from an individual. And while it reached its second highest level of giving on record, even adjusted for inflation, it is a relatively flat increase over 2020, with less than 1% increase. I'm sure many of you have tracked and maybe even been a lucky recipient of one of the many newsworthy mega gifts from this past year, but mega gifts from individuals totaled $15 billion in 2021, which is pretty extraordinary. And that does represent about 5% of all giving by individuals. Notably though, and I think the mega gift trend sort of plays into this, we see a dip in the total number of individuals contributing. So a dollars up, sort of donors down moment. Though individuals are still making up the vast majority of giving in the US, the decrease in overall number of individuals is a key trend for all of us to watch. This is really a great opportunity for all of us to look closely at our mid-level and major level giving programs to ensure that we're cultivating and stewarding top donors today, but also working on building the pipeline for donors in the years to come. We can work on empowering donors to give through a variety of vehicles that Phillippa pointed to in some previous slides, to ensure that we have a really inclusive lens to our mission storytelling and to our outreach efforts. These efforts, and making sure that we can accept gifts of all kinds and from all different people in our community will be important to ensure that we continue to see a sustainable growth in both the number of donors and dollars that we see year over year. Looking to the next slide, we'll take a look at foundation giving. It also reached its second highest level of giving on record when adjusted for inflation, but foundation giving actually decreased from 2020 to 2021 by just over 1%. Ultimately, this decline is marginal, and foundation giving continues to comprise a really important 19% of total giving. However, many foundations, even though we saw a slight decline in their giving, we saw some really important changes to their grant-making processes in 2021, such as providing more unrestricted funding and streamlining application and reporting processes. I think we all know there's still room to grow in that front, but we are excited by the changes that we're seeing. It's also notable that the increasing number of grant dollars coming from donor-advised funds that Phillippa pointed to, those are all reported here as foundation giving. In their 2021 report, it's notable that the Community Foundation Public Awareness Initiative reported that there was a 41% increase in grant dollars through DAFS. And so this emphasis and the focus on gift planning model that we talked about in terms of the importance of bequests are going to be important for both our foundation giving numbers and our individual giving numbers in the future. And looking to the next slide at corporate giving. Corporate giving comes in at about 4% of overall giving, but that really represents strong growth from prior years. It was the fastest growing giving source from 2020 to 2021, with an 18.3% growth rate over this year over last. This giving includes cash and in-kind gifts made from corporate giving programs, in addition to grants and gifts made by corporate foundations. As you can imagine, we think this growth is likely due to the increased confidence in the economy in 2021 versus 2020 at the onset of the pandemic. It has rebounded in what was a time of great uncertainty. And while these numbers are encouraging, we do still see corporate giving only making up at 4% of total giving. Since the recession of 2008 and 2010, from 2008 to 2010, corporate giving has been less predictable than other sources of giving. And while they were very responsive to the COVID-19 pandemic, they are really susceptible to stock market fluctuations. And we know that corporate giving is important, but again, shouldn't be the primary focus of our efforts. And I will hand it back to Doug now to lead us through some discussion.
Thanks, Phillippa. Thanks, Becky. Recognizing that that's a lot of data we just threw at you. And Terry, thanks for the great question. We will provide a link to the full report so that everyone can dig into some of the data. We'd love to open it up to each of you and see how these trends that we just shared align with what your organization might be experiencing in 2021 and now halfway through 2022. And would also love to hear from each of you what surprises you about this data, whether we just shared it with you now or you had the opportunity to review the report previously. And so we'll open it up to the group for a little bit of a conversation. We had some questions around the individual giving numbers and how the number of donors are decreasing, but the number of gifts and dollar value are increasing. Does that resonate with each of you? And are you seeing within your organizations less, a smaller number of donors?
I'm seeing here in the chat some observations around people returning to their previous giving trends. Just a note too, when we think about sectors, and this is particular for the arts, and as Phillippa noted, some of the public benefit organizations as well, as we sort of moved back away from some of the restrictions from the initial onset of the pandemic, we did see, the importance of being in artistic spaces, and that really contributing to the arts seeing some of their giving come back in 2021. And we can see that in some of these other areas too. There was a huge influx of giving to human services in 2020. As Phillippa shared, that leveled out a little bit. We're still seeing great generosity to that area, particularly now, as cost of living is increasing and the need for those services is greater than ever. But, curious if, and we can, field these questions now or later in the call, but if those of you coming from all different organizations are seeing any of these trends or seeing changes depending on what area of the sector your organization falls. Seeing some comments here about DAFS. These seem to be largely closed. So a note here about DAFS being counted among foundations, we will just point out that cultivating individual donors, despite where their giving is coming from, is so critical. The way that those funds are coming in are of course through a foundation, but as we said, those individual giving relationships are really going to influence not just DAFS, but also corporate giving is often really influenced through individuals. And so we see that as just such an important thing to keep watching, basically.
And I think the other point, Becky, thanks, that we're seeing with DAFS, and part of the reason why donor advised funds are becoming increasingly more prevalent is because of the strength of the stock market, despite, some recent blips. People with wealth and discretionary wealth are having significant appreciated assets that are often beneficial to put into a donor advised fund. Similarly, appreciated assets are also great to donate to nonprofits. So it just speaks to the importance of that relationship building. But the increase in DAFS, I do think, directly relates to the increase in the market. Curious also, we had a comment in the chat regarding matching gifts and the increase in corporate philanthropy. And how many of those are a part of matching gift programs. I'm curious if anyone on the call has any thoughts or feedback on that. I think anecdotally, I could say that 2020 was a challenging year for many large corporations because of the start of the pandemic. And so most organizations with discretionary funds that were often used for marketing or things that supported public organizations were cut. And those were added back into budgets in 2021. So just quite simply an opportunity for that increased growth. But curious, other organizations that have a strong corporate presence, did you experience similar results?
I lead the corporate giving for Lyric Opera, and I think maybe we saw a little bit of that drop off in early 2020, but again, like as I said in the chat, I consistently hear colleagues in fundraising make comments about how corporate giving is disappearing or going away, and that has truly not been my experience. In fact, we found that a lot of our corporate partners did what foundations did and opened up their giving to be not necessarily restricted to what they always have given, but rather unrestricted funding, which obviously helped us a lot in the pandemic. So it's great to see that data because it's certainly been my experience.
Great. Well, why don't we move forward and dig in a little bit to talking about Chicago specifically. And I'll turn it to Phillippa to get us started in that conversation.
Thank you, Doug. So as we zone in on the Chicago philanthropic market, we see here that Chicago is the third largest philanthropic market in the US, with over 11 billion in total giving. And as we look at individual giving, this constitutes 74.1% of total giving, whereas foundations account for 19.1% and corporations make up 6.7%. And this is really just proportional to the giving. Every giving source are important and should be explored. As we move to the next slide, we look at the sector breakdown of nonprofits in Chicago. And this is out of 52,950 organizations. We see here that 20% are social and human services organizations, 17% are religious organizations, 16% are educational organizations, 14% are foundations, 7% are arts, culture, and humanities organizations, 2% are health organization, with another 2% being environmental and animal welfare organizations. And then we have at 22% other organizations such as recreation and community development organizations and associations. So we do have a wide variety of nonprofits making impacts within the greater Chicago area, with opportunity for philanthropic opportunities. Then we'll look at a selection of the largest nonprofit organizations in Chicago. And this is based on their annual revenue. And while health organizations have the highest revenue of any sector at $34.8 billion, followed by educational organizations at $15.5 billion, they are only 2% of the philanthropic landscape within Chicago, and they constitute the most revenue. So there is room for discussion there as to why such a small percentage is allocated a lot of support, and it depends on varying trends, varying affinities of different individuals, corporations, and foundations. And it would be a great discussion topic for folks to think about as we get to our discussion section. As we dive deeper into individual giving, on our next slide, we look to, we see that in Chicago, individual giving is totaled at $8.2 billion. And if we look at the more than 3.5 million households in the greater Chicago area, religious purposes constitute the highest percentage of household charitable donations, 41%. And the average gift from individual donors in the greater Chicago area was $5,209. And if we look at the individual giving ratio, which is a representation of the total charitable contributions as a share of the total gross income, this puts us at 2.7%. So interesting statistics here to consider into what folks on average prioritize as things and organizations and passions that they give to. As we look to the next slide, we look at individual donor contributions based on their individual income levels. And we see here that those in the lowest income bracket contributed to the highest percentage of their income at 3.4% versus those in the highest income bracket at 2.9%. Those in the lowest income bracket, as we said, it is a little bit in between each other, but we do see that fluctuation in the giving, and this is also another good discussion topic. In terms of college and universities, they received the largest gifts from individual donors in Chicago in 2021. And as we look to the right side of the presentation, we see mega gifts to Illinois organizations and mega gifts from Illinois organizations. And this shows a majority of schools, universities on both categories. But in terms of mega gifts to Illinois organizations, we do see the Art Institute being a part of that category. And from Illinois donors, we do see civic organizations be a part of that survey category. And then I will pass it over to my colleague Becky to go even in depth into our Chicago landscape.
Thanks so much, Phillippa. If we're going to skip this discussion for now, given we did cover a little bit about this in a few moments ago, and we will have time for discussion at the end. So we're going to keep moving through and dive right into foundation and corporate giving in Chicago. So, the foundation landscape is significant here in Chicago, as many of you know, and we have a few significant stats outlined here. There are over 7,300 grant-making organizations or foundations in the greater Chicago area. These foundations employ over 1,000 people. They earn more than $6 billion in revenue, and they have assets of over $45 billion. Since 2003, nearly 700,000 grants have been made in Chicago, totaling $41 billion, which is, a pretty extraordinary stat. Again, nothing compared to the individual giving, but still an important part of our landscape here. Looking at the next slide, we look at foundation giving. If we look at it a little bit more in recent history and look at some of those mega gifts in the past year that Phillippa pointed to for individual giving as well, we can see that since 2021, more than 2,400 grants have been made and total over $385 million. These 10 foundations on the left have made the most grants in the past year. Keep in mind, this is just in the past year alone. These are not the largest foundations in Chicago necessarily. And we see here that the John and Catherine MacArthur Foundation topped the list with over $300 million in giving since 2021. The top funding priorities for foundations based on grants are primarily to education and health, followed by social and human services. Arts and culture comes in at the 4th highest priority, and religion comes down at number 7. So even though many of our individuals are giving to religious is the number 1 area of giving, we see that for foundations, it falls down to number 7. So just an interesting observation there. You'll notice in these mega grants on the right from foundations to Chicago nonprofits that funding is coming from both within and from outside of Illinois. And that's particularly true for some of the organizations based here in Chicago that have a national office and affiliates outside of the state. Beyond these mega gifts, though, we know that some of our local largest foundations are deeply focused on keeping their funding local here in Chicago, in the city, and in the greater Chicago area. And in some cases, we've seen those foundations refocus and really relocalize their efforts in recent years, like the Chicago Community Trust, the McCormick Foundation, et cetera. Looking to the next slide, we'll take a look at corporate giving insights in the greater Chicago area. Greater Chicago has the 3rd largest economy in the US with a GDP of nearly $594 billion. We have 38 Fortune 500 companies headquartered in Illinois, 16 of which are in the city of Chicago. I mentioned earlier that corporate giving saw the largest bump of any giving source between 2020 and 2021. But we do want to be sure to leave you with a realistic sense of what's possible and where limited resources on our fundraising teams can be allocated. And I know we talked about this a little bit in the chat and earlier in this conversation. Though we're really heartened by the increase in corporate giving from 2020 to 2021, it's relatively limited compared to individual relationships nationally and here in Chicago. We do know that Chicago companies, like many corporations across the country, want to give where their employees live and work. And so often, targeting those companies that are local to Illinois and to our city is a wise strategy. We also know, and I mentioned this briefly before, but corporate giving is often motivated by individual relationships and connections. And so consider focusing your strategy on continuing to build relationships with your board and other major donors to understand where corporate giving and opportunities might be possible. And of course, always engage those board members in cultivating those gifts to deepen their involvement with and their dedication to your cause. And I will now hand it back to Doug to wrap us up with some key takeaways from all of these facts and figures.
Mute. Thank you, Becky. I think some of the things that we want to just talk about and lift up as we wrap up or begin to open up for conversation is flexibility remains the name of the game. But as we see, philanthropy is more important than ever. Despite the economy, we saw a real meaningful increase to $481 billion from 2020 to 2021. But staffing challenges, supply chain, those challenges will remain in 2022, and we'll likely see those as an effect in our numbers in 2022 when we gather again this time next year. Technology will continue to play a role. Hybrid events, I think, are here to stay, even with the return of in-person events. Online giving represented 12% of total giving in 2021. This is an increase over pre-pandemic levels. And new ways of giving are increasingly popular, as we mentioned, donor advised funds, cryptocurrency, an increased focus in planned giving tools. All of this to say, and Becky touched on this earlier, we believe that individual giving and giving from family foundations and bequests are still where we should be focusing our efforts. Individual giving is still a primary focus. That decline in giving to education and human service, likely due to the need that was experienced in the height of the pandemic, has offset that increase in arts and culture and humanities. As people get back into person, people are attending the theater and other in-person events again. We're seeing that. And so there is a lot to be excited about as we look to wrapping up 2022 and thinking about end of year giving and giving days and that continued emphasis around technology and individual giving. And we'd like to open it up to the group to see what questions you have, to see if there are any thoughts or reflections that you might have to share before we wrap up.
Kathleen, please.
Hi. I was talking to some colleagues, and it was my question or discussion point was on the first part of what was on Doug's previous slide about nonprofits needing flexibility. It seems like some donors were very much on board with just giving money away and unrestricted and whatever you need to be able to do to respond in 2020 and even in 2021. And now it seems like it's kind of going back to the way things were, which I understand, but the ability for us to be flexible was so much easier when donors would just say, here is general operating funds. And now I'm seeing some donors say, well, you're back up and running and like things are going, back to normal. So I'm going to restrict my funding again. And I'm curious if, what other people are seeing or what the people from CCS are hearing in terms of how can we continue to impress upon funders that general operating really is the absolute best for us?
Start us off.
Yeah, it's a great question, Kathleen, and thanks for jumping in. I think that what we're seeing, at least at CCS, is an emphasis on a reinvigorated and a reimagined case for support. So what are we focusing on? and being able to really demonstrate impact in a very tangible way. Kathleen and I have had the opportunity to work together, and I'm sure she heard me make this joke previously about, when you're giving a donor a recognition opportunity, they want to know that that door handle is in honor of the gift that they gave, right? That it used to be that donors really wanted like a very tangible item. And I think what we're seeing, at least in our client partners, is the difference between that tangible item as opposed to ensuring efficiencies of the organization and laying a foundation for future growth and really sustaining future growth, right? Many organizations closed. Many nonprofits weren't able to sustain COVID. And so that an emphasis in the case around how we're going to be here for the future to serve the mission and the people that we serve is really that change. And I think that requires a change in strategic plan, that requires a change in leadership investment. And so we're really seeing kind of those two tracks running really parallel, and many organizations, CCS included, are having to take a look at strategic plans a year or two in because of where the world has gone, and really think about how do we pivot as we move into coming out of COVID, but all that's going on in the country in terms of social justice and human rights issues. And there are a lot of organizations competing for very worthwhile dollars, but being able to address those head on is something that we're seeing organizations becoming much more comfortable with and much more needing to do.
Yeah, I would just only add to that importance of forward-looking planning, and storytelling is also backwards looking, talking about the impact of the flexibility of those funds and really being able to point to metrics of impact and how those, I think that there's a fear that we all try to battle with telling our story with donors, is that general operating funds are some type of black hole and there's no way to report on the impact. And we know that's just not true, right? We know that general operating dollars are so critical to keeping the lights on, and to programming, and to staff, and to retention, and so many things. And so in addition to pointing to the importance of general operating funds looking forward, I think it's important too to be able to tie some real data points to what those funds helped you do during 2020 and 2021. And so to continue to make that case for support. So general operating doesn't feel like some type of default, but rather a very intentional choice to support the sustainability of an organization.
And just to add to Doug and Becky's response, Kathleen, you mentioned the donors would say, "Oh, you're out of the turmoil right now. We're restricting our funds." Well, they should also think about the future, and if another happening occurs like COVID-19, that you're prepared and you won't be in turmoil, as to build on that sustainability piece to ensure that the organization is there for years to come in a way that is fortifiable.
Kathy.
Yes, thank you. I had a quick question about, I've been seeing a little bit of rumblings about possible changes in minimum distributions from endowments of funds, of foundations and donor advised funds, or even like changing the way that they calculate the 5% or anything like that. Is that something that's reasonable to expect in the future, or is that more of a pipe dream? Because obviously freeing up more funds from the endowments would be good for all of us on this call.
I wish we had a magic 8-ball to be able to answer that question. Unfortunately, we don't. I do know that policies like that are very challenging to put into practice. So my uneducated opinion would say, don't worry too much about that today, but I wouldn't ask to be quoted on that either.
We'll just keep hope alive.
Exactly.
I was going to say, thanks for the question, Kathy. We'll keep dreaming. Question in the chat: is there a way to work together and leverage to leverage our position as the third largest philanthropic market? I'm not sure what that would look like, but can't help to think that we should amplify our dedication to the sector, especially if donors are keeping their giving local. Trisha, I think that's a great point. I'm not sure if that was your question or, yeah, great. I think that I was pleasantly surprised too to see that, of course, we always think of ourselves as the third largest city in the country, and that, our third largest economy and philanthropic market as well is really important and an exciting stat to be proud of. When we think about keeping giving local, and Doug and Phillippa, curious for your thoughts on this as well, or anyone really on the call. You know, I do double down on something mentioned slightly earlier in the slides, is that I think companies are really focusing on where their people want to give, where their employees want to give, and the organizations that they're involved in. And so I think that, you know, even though we've said many times over, you know, corporate giving is a small percentage compared to individuals, but the point is that corporate giving is influenced by individual giving. And so I think, you know, our work to engage people and to continue to importantly grow the number of donors and advocates and volunteers that we have, which we know is important now more than ever, because we did see fewer donors in 2021 versus 2020, that individual giving will continue to reap benefits across giving types and to keep money locally, as long as you know, we are engaging, you know, our communities and our neighbors in our organizations who are doing the important work here. If anyone is surprised by anything they've seen, or if this doesn't match what their organization is experiencing, or, you know, I saw a comment in the chat earlier that bringing this data to your board and your you know, your leadership is going to be helpful to show them why you're focusing your work where you are. You know, any other thoughts on that? Tula.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, the only thing I really worry about is the economic landscape that we find ourselves in, and just like the doom and gloom that we're hearing every single day, that I'm just a little afraid that people will not give as willingly or freely as they have in previous years. And what can, you know, what do you suggest organizations, big or small, can do to pivot and make sure that we can continue to engage our donors, and to make sure that our donors understand some of the circumstances we may find ourselves in if, in fact, you know, the economic situation doesn't get a little bit better. And, you know, it's just constantly on the news, especially at Easter Seals, where we have older donors. People tend to hold on to their money a little bit more because they're on fixed incomes.
Tula, it's a great question. I think a couple thoughts in no real order. You know, during times of financial or economic uncertainty, organizations often will see their annual fund flat, or perhaps have a potential decline, but major gifts increasing. I think that's evidenced in what we saw in terms of the data between 2020 and 2021, where the number of donors decreased, but philanthropy increased by a significant number of billions. And so, you know, an emphasis in major gifts in times of financial instability are important. The donors with wealth will still have the wealth, even in times of challenge. I think also your point, Tula, just putting a finer point on it, that donor stewardship, whether a $50 donor or a $50 million donor, is important. And if organizational donors are feeling supported in times of challenge, you know, they'll still give, even if it's a significantly smaller gift. We're also seeing the importance of monthly giving and recurring gifts as a way to engage donors in times of financial challenge, to see, you know, maybe they can still give their $100 gift, but they're giving it in, you know, $8.33 a month instead of, you know, $100 at one time. I think also challenge gifts or challenge matches are incentivizing for people. And so thinking about how you might have some sort of challenge as it relates to your annual fund could be an opportunity as well.
I think with the economy as it is right now, folks would definitely want to look at how they can leverage their funds. And in the nonprofit sector, it is an opportunity to invest in social impact. So framing in terms of the messaging, and as Becky mentioned before, we can definitely measure impacts within the nonprofit space to show that social impact within varying organizations, that they can see how their donations are building in different spaces and creating wealth, social wealth, or financial wealth as the fortifying of the nonprofit grows. So having that perspective, relaying that message, adding to the stewardship that Doug talked about can be a strategy to put forward if they're uncertain about where they want to put their discretionary funds. And nonprofits and social impact is definitely a credible opportunity.
In the chat, has CCS seen any trends around joint funding or funders collaborating to make gifts? That's a great question. And I actually want to answer it with something Doug just shared about matching gifts. I think that's particularly motivating for annual fund donors. And we really see those very popular with online giving as well. And it does a lot of things. You know, it first of all engages a major gift donor in being able to be a part of the strategy, in being able to, you know, bring their make their dollars go further. I think too, we actually see this work well with planned gift challenges as well. You know, planned giving can feel a little scary to some people, but when you have a major donor, sort of, you could have a current use dollar match against a planned giving challenge, a sort of number of bequests signed. That can work too. It's a little bit trickier, a little bit, you do have to build some language confidence and sort of get some mechanics in place on your fundraising team, but that can really be motivating as well. Because again, you know, I think we all know this, that people want to be part of a winning cause. And so when they see other people giving towards a goal or see that their dollars are going to go further, that can be really motivating. Robin, you know, if we think about larger donors collaborating to make gifts, I actually think, you know, just an observation is we're seeing public and private funding collaborations actually have a bigger role in philanthropic strategy. I think that's sort of a larger trend. I can't speak too deeply to, but we are seeing, you know, private donors wanting to see public funds committed to organizations as well, in order to feel like that their dollars are going to make a big difference there too. So just a few examples.
Well, we are grateful for everyone's time and for the great conversation today. Please, you know, do not hesitate to follow up with Becky, Phillippa, or myself with questions. But AFP, we're grateful for the opportunity to partner, and I will turn it back to Elizabeth to close us out.
Doug, Becky, Phillippa, thank you so much for your insights and your time today. Participants, let's all give a virtual round of applause for our speakers and the really important data and insights that they shared. So to all of our attendees, do remember that evaluations are available with the QR code that we're about to share. And also we're going to drop a link in the chat. A recording of today's session will also be available to all of you. I also want to give a shout out on behalf of AFP Chicago. If you are not a member of our growing community, I encourage all of you to consider joining. The benefits available to you are plentiful and include programs and dialogues and networking very similar to what we engaged with today. And you can find more information on our website and in the link in the chat as well about membership options and joining AFP Chicago. There's no shortage of great networking and professional development opportunities that are available at your fingertips as a member. This is a listing of our upcoming programs, which include continuous learning, our affinity groups, and member orientation, as well as some of our networking opportunities as well. So this is all available on the AFP Chicago website as well. And we encourage you to follow us on our social channels so you can stay up to date with all that is happening with our robust membership. Once again, I want to just extend my very deep thanks and gratitude on behalf of the entire AFP Chicago community to our colleagues from CCS Fundraising for today's conversation and for their generous support of our chapter and making our work possible. So with that, I hope everyone has a fantastic and beautiful afternoon, great summer, and I look forward to seeing you all at some of our upcoming programs. Thanks, everyone.